Thank you, Chair and Committee. We are now unmuted, and you may begin when you are ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. The meeting for Assembly Committee on Growth and Infrastructure will now come to order. Will the Secretary please call the roll?
Assemblyman Ellison.
Present.
Assemblyman Levitt.
Here.
Assemblyman Miller.
Present.
Assemblywoman Peters.
Here.
Assemblyman Roberts.
Here.
Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong.
Present.
Assemblyman Watts.
Here.
Assemblyman Wheeler,
Here.
Assemblyman Yeager,
Here.
Chair Monroe Moreno.
And I am here. We have all members present. Thank you all for showing up today. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Assembly Committee on Growth and Infrastructure. Today, we will enjoy a presentation on the state climate strategy. But before we begin addressing today's agenda, I want to briefly review how our virtual meetings will work. Although we're in different rooms, please make sure that your phones are on silent. Please keep your cameras on so that our secretary will know that we have a quorum. And if you wish to speak, you can raise your hand or just open your mic if you have a question, but make sure you state your name for the record, whether you're staff or legislator. It makes it much easier for our secretary to keep records when we state our name because she may not be able to see us. And for the public, as you know, the legislative building is currently closed. So all of our committee meetings will be held virtually, meaning the committee members, staff, and everyone else will be participating in this meeting either through Zoom or by telephone. In addition, people wanting to testify or present public comment will have the option to call in or submit written testimony or comments. This can be done online for today's meeting on Nellis, located on the legislative website. Members of the public have the option to submit an opinion on bills. They can sign up to participate during the public comment period at the end of our meeting. And the public comment will be limited to 3 minutes each. All the materials submitted for a meeting will be posted on the committee's page on the legislative website. The meeting can be viewed through our streaming service on the legislative's YouTube channel, both of which can be accessed on the legislative website. If you have missed a meeting and would like to know what happened, that is easy to do. All the committee meetings are recorded and posted on the legislative website, usually the next day. Anyone who would like to receive electronic notifications of the committee's agendas and minutes can do so by signing up on the Nevada legislative website or by contacting the committee manager via email. That email address is asmgi@asm.state.nv.us. And please, always don't hesitate to contact our committee staff if you have any questions. We are here to help. So today, I'm excited to have our first presentation for this legislative session. And we will welcome the presenters to the meeting. It will be a presentation on Nevada's climate strategy. And we have with us today, David Bobzien, who is the director at the Governor's Office of Energy. And from the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Director Bradley Crowley. And David Lovato and Kristen Everett. So thank you for joining us here in this virtual floor meeting. So if you were there, I'd like the presenters to go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Brad Kroll, the Director of the Nevada Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Can you hear me all right?
You're just a little muted, members. Or can you hear him?
Yeah, I can hear him.
I'll speak loudly. We can hear you on this end. Madam Chair, thank you for, and members of the committee, thank you for convening this important hearing today to look at Nevada's climate goals, our challenges, and our opportunities. As I said, my name is Bradley Kroll. I'm the Director of the Nevada Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here with y'all as we go through. second. Minimize it. Kevin, you just do less than that. I apologize. My technical skills are not proficient. So you didn't get the second share. All right, I believe that should be working if everyone can see that on the screen. As Chair Monroe Moreno said, I'm joined today by my colleague, David Bobzian, the Director of the Governor's Office of Energy, Dr. Kristen Averett, who serves as our state's first ever climate policy coordinator. And I also have with me today Mr. Greg Lovato, the administrator of our Division of Environmental Protection. So to kick this off, as a reminder to folks, while Nevada has long been a leader in clean energy generation by way of our vast renewable energy resources and having one of the first and most aggressive renewable portfolio standards in the country, our work to further mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and address the impacts of climate change in Nevada have only recently begun in earnest. However, while we have much work to do to address climate pollution across all economic sectors in Nevada, this critical work also presents significant opportunities for Nevada's economic recovery, lasting economic diversification, and creating new, good-paying jobs through targeted investments in modern, climate-resilient infrastructure throughout our state. Our efforts to more broadly tackle climate change began in earnest in 2019 under Governor Sisolak's leadership when he joined Nevada with the U.S. Climate Alliance. As you'll see on this slide, the current membership of the Climate Alliance includes approximately 25 states with both Democratic and Republican governors, representing over 50% of the U.S. population. As an Alliance member, Nevada is committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. And in exchange for adopting these targets, Nevada receives valuable technical and analytical support from the Alliance to help track our emissions profile and receive input for policy designs that may work best for Nevada. Also in 2019, as a complement to Nevada's membership in the U.S. Climate Alliance, the Nevada legislature passed two important bills to enhance Nevada's focus on climate change. The first, SB 358, increased Nevada's RPS to 50% clean electricity generation by 2030. The second piece of legislation, SB 254, established in statute the economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction milestones for Nevada. These emissions reduction goals set by SB 254 are on the screen as follows: 25% by 2025, 45% by 2030, and net zero by 2050. Thankfully, the recently enhanced RPS under SB 358 will play a significant role in meeting these targets. But the RPS alone will not be sufficient to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction targets in 2025 and 2030. That said, as was stated recently by Senator Chris Brooks, who was the sponsor of these two bills in the 2019 session, said, we are going to, quote, we are going to use the carbon reduction goals of the state to guide our clean energy investments. And that's exactly what we're hoping to do in our climate strategy, which you will hear about today. This next slide, and this will be my last slide before turning over to Director Bobzian, shows Nevada's most recent greenhouse gas emissions projections as assembled by the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection. As you can see, Nevada is currently projected to fall 4% short of our 2025 goal and 19% short of our 2020 goal. So we clearly have work to do. However, if you look closely at this graph, you will see greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector steadily declining under the parameters of Nevada's RPS. But emissions from the transportation sector, industrial emissions, and emissions from residential and commercial buildings continue to increase under current Nevada policies. Therefore, it is in these three key areas that Nevadans must come together to develop Nevada-specific policies and make targeted investments to bend the emissions curve in these three areas. And we must do so as soon as possible if we hope to reach our near and medium-term goals in 2025 and 2030. With that, I'm happy to turn over to Director Bobzian to discuss actions we are taking now to mitigate climate pollution from various sources and articulate much more that needs to be done. Director Bobbsey.
Thank you, Director Kroll, and thank you, Chairman Moreno and members of the committee for this opportunity to present to you today. I would like to give you just a kind of a quick snapshot of where we are headed into this legislative session in terms of climate action initiatives. As Director Kroll mentioned, with the governors joining Nevada to the Climate Alliance, Governor Sisolak has taken bold action addressing the climate crisis, and that culminated in 2019, at the end of 2019, with Executive Order 2019-22, with the goal of moving beyond the renewable portfolio standard and electricity generation to focus on all sources of GHGs in Nevada across all of the different economic sectors. He tasked his entire administration to work on the challenges and opportunities behind addressing climate, and tasked both Director Kroll and myself and our offices as the leads in that effort. The key milestone for that executive order was the delivery of the state climate strategy, and that is what we're presenting to you today. That was to be delivered by December 1, and we met that milestone. And so some of the activities that have been happening since the last session, the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection launched the Clean Cars Nevada initiative, and this is to develop new regulations to facilitate the availability on a broad scale of low emission vehicles known as LEV vehicles and zero emission vehicles known as ZEV vehicles. And you can learn more about that effort at that hyperlink there. We have a number of activities related to use of the Volkswagen settlement administered by the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection. A lot of these activities focus on replacing older diesel vehicles and the pollution that comes with them, as well as replacing ground support equipment with electric upgrades at both McCarran and Reno Tahoe airports. I would note that while the contracts are out on those, there are some changes to the schedule based on pandemic activities that are happening, but that's been a major achievement so far in our work. GHG emissions reduction strategy. Kudos to Director Swallow and all of our colleagues at the Nevada Department of Transportation. They have put into their One Nevada statewide transportation plan GHG reduction strategies, and they have been a key partner in this effort in the administration addressing climate. Certainly, coming from the Governor's Office of Energy, there is the Nevada Electric Highway expansion. I apologize for not missing this one error on the slide. I-15 has been completed, that stretch of the Nevada Electric Highway. Governor Sisolak at the first part of 2020 joined us in Mesquite for a ribbon cutting of the final station that enabled us to be eligible for federal certification as an EV alt fuel corridor. We project substantial completion of the rest of the Nevada Electric Highway on Interstate 80, US 50, US 95, and US 93 in 2021. We have enhanced energy efficiency standards. Many of you will recall Assembly Bill 54 that passed unanimously last legislative session, establishing light bulb efficiency standards. Those are now in place, and we expect to be able to realize an average Nevada household saving of over $81 a year. And lastly, the Public Utilities Commission, if you review their strategic report for FY 2020 to 2025, climate change is front and center right at the beginning of that report, and is a very important component to their work moving forward. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Averitt, who, as Brad introduced previously, is our state climate coordinator.
All right, thank you, Director Bobzian, and thank you, Madam Chair, and to the committee for the opportunity to talk to you today. So, as Director Bob just pointed out, already see quite a bit of action as it relates to climate change across the entire state. With the recognition of the need to tie everything that's being done together and to have a home for climate action, Governor Sisolak launched his State of Nevada Climate Initiative in August of 2020. There we go. So the Nevada Climate Initiative, it's really intended to be the home of climate action across the entire state. So with this in mind, we intentionally designed the climate strategy such that it would provide the scaffolding around which we could build the entire NCI, which is the acronym that we've been using for this. The three goals of the strategy: one, to provide a framework for reducing Nevada's greenhouse gas emissions across all economic sectors. Number two, to lay the groundwork for climate adaptation and resilience planning. And three, to establish a structure for continued ongoing climate action across the entire state. The climate strategy is really about building the foundation for the legacy of what the climate initiative can be. It's not going to be a single effort, a single plan, or a single roadmap that's going to help us to address all the challenges posed by climate change. It's going to take a lot of action on multiple fronts. To build the climate strategy and meet the scope of the entire executive order, we set up 10 different working groups focused on very different aspects of climate change. These teams included over 56 individuals representing 15 agencies, as well as 3 of our NSHE research institutions, UNLV, UNR, and DRI. And it was also a pleasure that we were able to have 6 students who were contributing to the climate strategy. Working with stakeholders was another very important component in building the strategy. Beyond one-on-one messaging, small group briefings, and the seminar presentations that we held, there were 2 key stakeholder engagement activities. The first was a scientific survey about attitudes and perspectives on climate change that was developed and administered by faculty at UNLV. We had over 1,500 responses from across 13 of Nevada's counties, as well as Carson City, to that survey. The second was a series of virtual listening sessions. These were convened by representatives from different state agencies that were relevant to the topics at hand. And this was not about us from the state perspective presenting to the public and presenting to stakeholders. It was about listening to stakeholders. So these were conducted in the spirit of public comment. We actually stuck around for every listening session and ensured that everybody who wanted to offer public comment was afforded that opportunity. We do have archives of all of these meetings on our website at climateaction.nv.gov. So to the strategy itself. As Director Kroll pointed out, we did in fact meet the key milestone of releasing the climate strategy to the public on December 1st. And we did release it as a web-based document. You can find it at climatestrategy.nv.gov. Now, we released the document in a web format for multiple reasons. And the first is that we really wanted to ensure that it was approachable. Given the scope of the executive order, the strategy is necessarily quite comprehensive, and there is quite a bit of material. So all told, if we were to print it out single-spaced at 10.5-point font, it would be over 160 pages. If somebody handed me that kind of document on climate, it would be pretty intimidating to dig into. So we structured a landing page, which you can see here on the right side of your screen, that really allows people to dig into the issues that they think are most important to them. The second reason why we really want to make sure that it was web-based is that it really lends itself to the concept of a living document. This strategy is intended to be used. We want to be able to update different components. We want to be able to add to it. We want to be able to ensure that it is up to date with the latest science, the latest insights, and the latest information about what actions are being taken at the state level. So with that in mind, I'm going to provide you an overview of the individual components of the strategy. So the first section of the strategy is about what we do and what we don't know with respect to climate change and the impacts to Nevada. This was actually done, it was led by our state climatologist, and the team was composed of the best climate scientists in the state from UNR, UNLV, and DRI. This section represents the very first assessment of climate change that's across the entire state, and I will say it's fairly complex. However, there are two things that I would point you to if you're going to dig into this section. The first is the table of climate impacts that is right at the very start of this particular section of the strategy. This table lays out how the impacts of climate affect different sectors across the state. These sectors include public health, agriculture, ranching, tourism, entertainment, as well as water resources. The second thing I would point you to is at the very end of this section. And this is where the research team lays out what the risks of climate change are to the state. All told, this component of the strategy really is the baseline work that's necessary to ensure that Nevadans are resilient to the impacts of climate change so that we can really dig in and assess our risks and our vulnerabilities and plan for the future. The next section of the strategy is about what Nevadans think about climate change. It includes the initial results from the scientific survey about climate that was conducted by our colleagues at UNLV. And the key takeaway here is that Nevadans are concerned about climate change, and the initial results show that over 75% of those who responded are very concerned about the climate. And drought is the topic of greatest concern. This was somewhat surprising because this was actually administered during the massive wildfires and all that really poor air quality that we experienced in the late summer and the fall. Now, there are many other insights that to be gleaned from the climate survey, and I recently had a conversation with Professor Bloomfield from UNLV, who is leading this effort, and she and her students have almost completed their deep dive into the survey results, and it will be our pleasure to share that information when it's available. All right, so now I'm going to talk about what is really the centerpiece of this iteration of the strategy, which is our mitigation policy analysis. So what we did here, first, is that we developed a framework that would help policymakers. This is helping all of you and helping the decision makers across the state to effectively shape our climate solutions so that they work for Nevada. Then what we did is we applied this framework to very specific climate policies. So the very first question that we always get is, how did we select the policies that we looked at in the strategy? How do we decide who we're going to include? Well, per SB 254, the NDEP greenhouse gas inventory that is delivered annually is required to include a catalog of policies that could be implemented to help our state achieve emissions reduction targets. So all of the mitigation focused policies that are contemplated in the climate strategy were drawn directly from the policy catalog that was included in the 2019 iteration of that inventory. So for convenience, we included on our website the relevant text from that policy catalog, and we provided links to the different parts of the strategy where we addressed the relevant policy, the program, or the concept that was laid out in the NDEP document. At this point, I also just want to add that the policies in the NDEP catalog, they were actually drawn primarily from the policies that have been considered or have been implemented by other U.S. Climate Alliance states. In total, we specifically evaluated 17 different policies across 5 different economic sectors. And there are 2 things that I want to emphasize at this point. The first, to be abundantly clear, we did not develop new mitigation-focused policies in this strategy. We also did not make specific recommendations to implement any of these policies as is, nor did we prioritize one policy or another. The reason is, quite frankly, we have to get to net zero emissions by 2050. So nothing is really off the table at this point. We're at the point where we need to consider every option that is available to us. So our approach was to look at all 17 policies and figure out, how do we shape them and how do we make them work for Nevada? Now, the way that we did this was through the design of our policy framework. The framework that we developed had 4 different metrics. The first was about greenhouse gases. If we were to implement the policy, what kind of reduction in greenhouse gases might we realize and in what time frame? The second was focused on climate justice, environmental justice, social justice. What impacts might this policy have on low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous populations? Have we considered what net benefits we might be able to bring to the table to benefit those communities? And third is about budget. What does it cost to implement this kind of program, and what would it cost to administer in the long term? And finally, implementation feasibility. This is about legal barriers to decarbonization. Is it we have the authority and statute already, or is it, wow, we need actually congressional action to make something happen? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a couple examples about how this framework can work for you, how it can work for the decision makers and the policy makers to help shape policy. So for the first metric, let's take the example of the policy analysis that's related to the transition from fossil fuel electricity generation to clean energy sources. In this write-up, the team points out that we have 2 coal-fired power plants that are currently operating in the state. And we have a fairly good idea of what the annual emissions are from both of those coal-fired power plants. But the exact timing of the retirement of both of those plants is not certain. So we're not confident that the retirement of these we're not confident that this transition can help us meet, in particular, our near-term goals in 2025 and 2030. For this reason, the working groups assigned not that green color, but that lighter green color. Now, again, because this is not bright green, this is not an indication that we shouldn't move forward with this policy. In this case, the working group and the team is pointing out that if we're going to use the transition from coal-fired generation to clean energy to meet our near-term targets, there may need to be guardrails put in place that would help us direct timing of those retirements. So the climate justice metric. In this one, let's consider the analysis for the transition from residential and the commercial use of natural gas. In this case, the research clearly shows that the use of indoor gas appliances, and specifically gas ovens in particular, can compromise indoor air quality. In fact, children are particularly vulnerable, and those kids that live in households with gas stoves are 42% more likely to have asthma than those that do not. So this transition could have very outcomes. On the other, we heard clear from a lot of Nevadans who were concerned about the costs associated with replacing natural gas ovens. So issues that need to be discussed and need to be reconciled and balanced. However, we do have to get to net zero 2050, and that does necessitate a transition from natural gas. So the third metric, this is about the economics, and we took a slightly different approach here. What we did was we actually looked at the investments that others are making in order to support the implementation and the administration of these types of policies. So in other words, what kind of appropriations are other states making? How many FTEs do they need to administer these programs? And we provided that information to give an idea of what kind of investment might need to be made here in our state to implement these programs once they're shaped. And then finally, the implementation feasibility. This content was the content for this particular metric, it was actually led out of the AG's office in collaboration with faculty and V. Boyd Law School. And for this particular policy, which is about energy labeling and energy audits, the team really laid out where the authority to make this should exist. And then they laid out a fairly clear path forward for implementation. And in this case, it would require legislation. So this is intended to provide a guide for how we could actually implement the policies moving forward. So moving on to the next section of the strategy, complex challenges for Nevada. Now, reducing and ultimately ameliorating all our greenhouse gas emissions while preparing and planning for more extreme droughts, but also extreme, more frequent and larger floods, with rounded out by longer, bigger wildfire seasons, also recognizing environmental justice issues. Tackling climate change is complex and it is complicated. If it was easy, we would have solved it already. We would have designed what we need to do to move forward. But finding solutions is not insurmountable. It can be accomplished. So our approach to this section of the strategy was about laying bare all of the issues at play within 4 very discrete themes that are focused on the need for economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The 4 themes: transportation transformation, transmission planning and grid modernization, urban planning and green buildings, and land use and natural and working lands. So by laying out all of the complexities, acknowledging stakeholder concerns, this allows us to identify who's invested in these issues. I mean, who cares about them, who's impacted, and who has the authority, who has the influence to help us implement the solution, or develop solutions. Helps us define who needs to be at the table, who needs to be involved in discussions, and with the ultimate goal of developing a suite of policies, programs, and plans that are harmonized across different levels of governance. Because make no mistake, it's not going to be a single federal action, state action, or municipal action that is going to solve our problems as they relate to climate change and help us navigate the future. It's going to take everybody working together. And I think this segues nicely into the next section, which is focused on monitoring, modeling, and managing greenhouse gas emissions. My top line summary of this section is you can't manage what you can't count. Now, we're all aware that NDEP has its greenhouse gas inventory, and they're really cataloging everything statewide. However, there's a relatively long list of entities who are developing or have already developed their own greenhouse gas inventory process. So similar to the point that we just made about the last section about need to harmonize our policies across levels of governance, we also need to harmonize our accounting. Right now, for example, Clark County might make some or implement some policy and that will significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But there's no guarantee at this point that that will be captured in the statewide inventory. Now, this isn't about, oh, gee, the state wants to take credit for everything, or we must make sure that we're accounting for every bit of carbon. This is really about how we plan for the future. Again, from that integrated perspective, the important part is projecting the impact of a policy on greenhouse gas emissions, because it might be a municipal policy that will actually get us closer to our greenhouse gas emissions targets than a state policy. And we need to have that information so we can move forward collectively. Unless everything is aligned, the planning horizons, the accounting, we won't be able to optimize our opportunities and make the best in the future. Another section of the strategy focused on lead by example, which is the term of art for adopting internal strategies across the executive branch state agencies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Director Bobzian alluded to this and NDOT's efforts in his opening slides. So right as we began building the climate strategy, NDOT started the process of developing and implementing their own internal policies to help them reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. NDOT actually made a very significant contribution to the strategy in that they documented their process. So the result is a roadmap that any other agency in the state, they can pick up, they can adopt, and they can use to develop their own internal policies to maximize their reductions in greenhouse gases at their own agency. So now we're going to segue into economics. Here, we really address the economics of climate action. In the policy analyses, we show that states are investing in climate action. Addressing climate change, it's not a revenue neutral proposition. It requires an upfront investment, but it will cost a lot more in the long run if we do not act.
Because I have to talk.
In this section of the strategy, we conducted an analysis using what's called the social cost of carbon, where we were able to estimate the avoided costs of meeting our greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. By using a very conservative approach to this calculation, if we meet the net zero carbon emission reduction target by 2050, we would prevent $4 billion in economic damages by that year. $4 billion. The return on investment on investments now, today, in climate action will pay off in spades in the long run. So following on the thread of economics is economic recovery and revitalization. The takeaway from this section of the strategy is that Nevada can and should ensure that climate action is part of the state's economic recovery. It's part of our resilience planning and our job growth efforts, and really that climate needs to become hardwired into the state's economic development plans now and in the future. There were 3 pillars of this section. The first, to quote the U.S. National Climate Assessment, climate change is expected to cause substantial net damage to the U.S. economy. But fortunately, we can prepare and ensure the resilience of our economy. And one way that we can do this is actually the focus of the second pillar of this section, and that's about jobs and the new clean energy economy. There are tremendous opportunities to amplify job creation, be it through clean energy technology, transportation, water conservation technology. Nevada can truly demonstrate we have the capabilities and we're uniquely positioned to demonstrate how to mobilize a clean energy economy across multiple sectors. And finally, workforce. The NSHE institutions, in particular the community colleges, can support building a workforce and ensuring that we're retraining our workforce for these emerging industries, those that we know are coming down the pike and those that we don't know about yet. But we know that there are going to be massive innovations on the horizon when it comes to clean energy. And the research institutions, they can contribute further through additional R&D and innovation that directly connects with our climate action goals across the state. Now, one could argue that this final section of the strategy is possibly the most important. It's about climate governance. If Nevada is going to be positioned to really respond to climate change, a robust governance structure really needs to be put in place. Now, based on the positive experiences of other states, as well as insights from scientific research, there are 6 guiding principles that should be adhered to when developing a climate-focused organizational structure. The first, intergovernmental and interagency coordination. This has been a common thread through everything that I just laid out in the entire strategy. It takes everybody and it takes us talking together to be able to come up with and optimize our solutions. The next is stakeholder and community engagement. Now, in this iteration of the strategy, we did our best with respect to stakeholder engagement, but we can and we should and we will do better moving forward. This is particularly important as we address environmental justice issues, because it's very clear in order to develop solutions, we need to make sure that the right people are at the table from the start, not that they're brought in later, but they're there from the beginning. The third, science-based climate assessment. The science is evolving rapidly, and we need to ensure that we understand the risk profiles as they are changing in real time. We need to be up to date and able to move and pivot on a dime, which brings us to the next principle, is adaptive governance. We can't be tied down by red tape. We need to make sure that we are able to mobilize quickly to address issues as they come up, but also to seize opportunities. Executive leadership and staff. These need to be specifically focused on climate. Planning for climate change is not the same as planning as traditional planning. There's much more risk to balance, and there's a lot more uncertainty. It's a different approach. It takes very different expertise. Excuse me. And it also requires, It also requires that there is leadership from the top, demonstrating that climate is a priority. Along these lines, there was the National Academy's report that just came out 2 days ago. And in it, they actually recommend that every state have a net zero transition office within their capital. That is the level at which we need to ensure that we're moving forward rapidly. And then finally, dedicated resources. This is a common theme. Climate action is not a revenue neutral proposition. It is actually going to cost us, but in the long run, it could be far more costly. And we need to be thinking about the together. If Nevada is truly going to navigate the climate-related challenges and take advantage of the opportunities ahead. It's critical that we design and implement an organizational structure with clear processes and clear authorities. So to summarize, these are the key takeaways. Wanted to put them in one place for all of you. And I'm not going to read all of these, but to summarize, Nevadans want action. Climate is happening right now. We can do something. We hope that we armed everybody with the tools to be able to design policies that will work for Nevadans. We can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions across multiple sectors of our economy, and we can, should, and will integrate EJ into how our policies moving forward. It is, again, need to be thinking about how investments now and the long-term ROI, and Nevada uniquely suited to leverage climate action and have it benefit our. And finally, I want to leave you with this. We have laid out a fairly sweeping climate strategy here. There is a lot of content and a lot to dig into, and I did the best I could to cover it in a relatively short amount of time. But it's going to take a robust governance structure to really realize the tactical implementation of everything that's laid out in this strategy. A durable organizational structure to focus on climate will ensure that the scaffolding that we've really built with the strategy results in a long-term legacy around the Nevada Climate Initiative. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Directors Bob, Zian, and Kroll to talk about our critical steps.
Thank you, Kristen. Madam Chair, members of the committee, this is Brad Kroll, Director at the Nevada Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, and I'll try and bring that last slide up. But basically, we there you go. So basically, now is the time. We've set the stage with the climate strategy and other efforts that we can do under existing policies, but now it's time to look at what more we can and should be doing. So this is an invitation from us to want to work with you to develop Nevada-specific policies that are smart, that will enhance economic development, while also helping us reach our climate goals. And so with this product, and Kristen, Dr. Averett did amazing work pulling this together. We hope to use it as the basis and the roadmap to engage in smart policymaking with you as legislators. And unless Director Bobson has anything to add, we're happy to answer any questions and look forward to working with each of you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I have to say, Kristen, I love your enthusiasm. You can see the energy, and I guess a play on words for this committee, but oh my goodness, thank you. Thank you. You made what some people might think was boring. You made it really exciting and kept everyone's attention. Thank you for that. And thank you all for the work that you all have been doing. We have had an interesting interim since our last legislative session, but you all have come together and done great work. I've heard this presentation once before and it still makes me energized. I must say though, I'm not giving up my gas stove just yet, okay? I love my gas stove. So let's tell families that may be listening how we can help getting, when you look at slide 4, we're falling short for our 2025 and our 2030 goal. So I'd like to have a conversation of what we can do for those families that might be listening online, watching us online, what we can do better on everyday things to help us get closer to that, because I don't want to fall behind on what our goals are. Those little things that we can help, and then the big picture things of, as the policy wise. But I know we also have a number of our members that have questions, but I just wanted to let you all know I'm very impressed with the work you're doing, and I'm loving the energy in the room right now. So our first person for questions will be Assemblyman Yeager.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And, I just want to repeat what Assembly, our chair said. I mean, fantastic presentation. Thank you for the enthusiasm. And I'm just very, very impressed that you were able to get all of this done during the global pandemic. When this climate strategy document first arrived in my inbox, to be honest, I was quite surprised when I opened it up and saw how long and comprehensive it was. So I just want to say thank you. I know it wasn't easy. And so, really, I just have one question with maybe two parts, if you'll allow me, Madam Chair. And that question is, in terms of outreach, it sounds like you did quite a bit with the survey from UNLV and then reaching out to interested persons. I'm just kind of interested in, now that we have this strategy, we have the data, how has outreach been, talking to everyday Nevadans about the importance of trying to follow through on this and meeting our goals? And sort of related to that, I don't know if you've experienced this, but I found when you're trying to convince people to do things that avert economic damages or avert costs, sometimes it can be hard to get buy-in for that because as human beings, we tend to look at the immediate and want to quantify things right away. And it can be hard to make people change behavior when we're looking at, 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. I think we all know it's important, but the execution can be pretty difficult. So I just wondered if you could touch a little bit on what outreach is now to Nevadans and how to address that question of stressing the importance of acting now so we don't have to do things 30 or 40 years from now.
Madam Chair, David Bobzien, for the record, through you to Assemblyman Yeager. I'll take a first crack at those two questions, but I think I'll turn it to Dr. Averitt to talk more extensively on the outreach. To the outreach itself, and we very much appreciate the kudos. Needless to say, the world changed dramatically following the governor's issuance of the executive order at the end of 2019. We had originally envisioned a very comprehensive statewide community-specific outreach effort that was going to involve a lot of in-person face-to-face meetings. All that changed, but really under Dr. Averitt's leadership, we were still able to mount a very impressive outreach effort that included a number of video listening sessions and other outreach to really bring people to the table. And I think you will see in the executive order itself, and we know that this is of utmost importance to Governor Sisolak, the solutions around addressing our climate crisis revolve everyone being at the table. And we think that you'll find that the spirit of this strategy really is a table setting for consideration of those policies and the need to have all voices, particularly the voices of the communities that are most impacted. This has been incredibly rewarding work for all of us, particularly from the perspective of how the world has changed in the global pandemic and how it has highlighted the very immediate impacts on a whole range of communities across our state. And so going forward, we believe that this effort is, if anything, even more important now as we're addressing public health impacts to all kinds of communities across the state. I think to your question about those longer term investment discussions and when they are timed and the concept of no regrets solutions, things that we can start down the path on now that we know that we can build upon. Again, the 2050 goal that this legislature established in 2019 of near zero or net zero emissions is a very tough one, but it is doable. But it's going to require a long-term scale of action and thinking. And so, Chair Monroe-Moreno, I hear you about your stove. Certainly, the members of this effort have our own relationships with gas in our personal lives. And, that's a perfect example of, if you look at that section and spend time with it, there is a recognition that there's no easy pull it off the shelf. Here's the BDR you need to run to address this specific issue. Certainly, it is well understood. And I heard from an executive from the American Gas Association this morning at a conference I was at, about the long-term bridge opportunities that gas provide. Nonetheless, it does produce greenhouse gases. And so, what is that long-term transition strategy? How does that work? And that is a perfect example of the complicated policy questions that are in front of the legislature, regulators, et cetera. Though there are assets, there are investments, there are benefits currently that the public enjoys, but at what point do the downside of those benefits outweigh those? And so that is hopefully that's responsive to your cost and investment question, Assemblyman. But with that, I may turn it over to Dr. Averett in case I missed any of the details that you should hear about outreach, but then also what's next, because this is not done as a strategy document, and we are very hopeful to continue it into the future.
Right. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Assemblyman, for the question. And yes, so first, a little bit about that public outreach component. Since we dropped the strategy in December, we of course wanted to make sure that we're available to all of you for what you need. And so please do reach out to us, because we are available to provide what information that we can. And in terms of the reaction from those that we have had the opportunity to present to you about this, the logical question is, this is great, what's next? And that is really what we're hoping to figure out as we move forward. But I think, as I hope came through in our presentation and a briefing on the strategy, in my professional opinion, what I think needs to be next is designing and implementing a governance structure. We need to get to work very quickly, very rapidly, to address all the emerging challenges that we laid out in that strategy. And we really don't have a lot of time to spare. And so we look forward to working with different folks across the government to make sure that we design that and we figure out a way forward, because we really don't have much choice in the matter. And that's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Assemblyman Yeager. Next up, we're going to have Assemblywoman Peters.
Thank you, Chair. So this is, of course, near and dear to my heart, and part of the reason why I ran for office, and one of the areas that I'm really excited to be participating in policy changes within. I have a variety of questions, some of which have to do with the inventory, which I'll take offline and chat with you about later. But the big question I have is, we talk about climate change kind of as though it's this presenting enigma, but we are experiencing challenges today that do cost us in the day-to-day efforts of running our state and of living our lives. And I think it's exacerbated in Nevada with some of the temperature differentials we've been seeing in our more urban areas. And I just was wondering if you guys have quantified, and you did in your climate strategy, quantify the potential reduction of economic damages by 172 to 876 million by 2030 and 4 billion by 2050. But today, what do those costs that we're incurring look like? Do you have that information that you could share with us? And you know, I want to talk about, I guess, what we're really spending today that's impacting the state budget scenario we're in today, and how important it is that we invest in these areas now, not in 5 years or whenever we can get to it.
Assemblyman Peters, this is Brad Kroll. I'll take a first shot at responding to that question and let others fill in some of the blanks. But I think part of the basis of your question is, not only do we need to be reducing emissions in Nevada, we need to be addressing the impacts that we're currently seeing and experiencing in Nevada from climate change. And those are real, and they do have a cost, a social cost, an economic cost, a public health cost, depending on the various impacts. But we see it to our natural landscapes in the form of wildfires, for example. We see impacts to aging infrastructure for more extreme weather events, that if we don't build that infrastructure back in a smart, climate resilient way, it's going to crumble again. So we need to be thinking long term. In our urban areas, particularly in the Reno, Sparks, and Las Vegas, Henderson area, those two areas are two of the fastest warming cities in the United States, but it's not strictly related to the broader issue of climate change. It's largely related to the urban heat island effect. And this comes down to an important objective of doing smart urban planning, where we need to be increasing our urban tree canopy, for example, to limit that heat island effect that's raising temperatures in Clark County and Washoe County. So, these seem like small things, but they really do need to be implemented across the city, county, state, and federal sectors to have an impact. But they are real, and as we diversify our economy, we're looking at outdoor recreation as a growing part of that. Well, if our natural resources are not in a good shape that people want to visit, or our transportation infrastructure isn't such that they can get there in a cost-effective and a clean or an easy way, those are barriers that we need to take very seriously. And I'll turn over to Dr. Averitt or Director Bobstein for more.
So Kristen Averitt for the record, and thank you for the question. So the way that we came up with that calculation was using something called the social cost of carbon, and that is calculated strictly based off emissions. And so we did not, and I don't think we have the tools at hand to be able to calculate, for example, the cost of a wildfire that has been, has been juiced up by climate change. So we're not really able to break it down quite like that. That said, if you actually look at the cost of weather-related events in the past, that cost, the number of billion-dollar events that are happening every year in terms of impacts on our economy are increasing steadily through time. But it's very hard to really go through that attribution and say, this is an additional cost that's been realized because of this very, very specific event. Thank you.
And I may add quickly, unless Director Bobstein has more as well. I think one of the not talked enough about eventualities in Nevada that has a significant climate nexus and is going to have a significant economic impact on us is drought. I'm worried more about drought than I'm about wildfire and floods, because many models have us in a long-term drought right now, and water is the lifeblood of our economy and our community in Nevada. And we're already the most arid state in the nation. And if we're facing more arid conditions due to climate change, we're in real trouble on a number of fronts. So drought is something that we're also thinking about drought in the form of water security, we're thinking about in a very serious way.
Thank you for those responses. I know that personally, I've spent more money on cooling my house in the last couple of years than I ever have before. And that, is a direct cost to my living conditions and a consideration in moving to the regions that we love to live in Nevada. So I'm really excited about implementing some of these strategies, and thank you so much for your effort and expertise in this area and bringing this really into actionable items that we can do as policymakers to make a big difference.
Thank you for the question. Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. My question directed to any one of you who are on our panel today. I have a couple of them, if the Chair would indulge. The first one is, why are commercial and residential uses put into the same category? If you could answer that one. And then what is we peel off the residential out of this whole overall contribution to GHG, what is the residential contribution to the overall climate, to overall greenhouse gases? And third is, I just would like a response to the trying to get coal-fired electricity generation offline. But how then do we deal with the delivery of electricity? I have a son who is a sort of a little engineer kind of science mind. And I can remember when he was in junior high school, we were talking about delivery of electricity and how we lose so much. And if we're going to use different processes to do that, how do we retain the strength of that so that we're not losing it and then having to do whatever it is a lot just to get electricity from, one place to another? And thank you. Excellent presentation. I'm so impressed. You did a wonderful job, Ms. Everett, and I'm excited about this topic.
So, Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong, I'm going to suggest that Director Bobzian take the last part of your question, and then Greg Lovato, our NDEP administrator here with me, take the first two parts of your question. So Director Bobzian, please go ahead.
I'd just like to remind everyone before you speak, please make sure you state your name for our secretary who's not in the room and can't see us and won't recognize everyone's voice. Thank you.
Roll for the record. Thank you.
And thank you for the reminder, Madam Chair, and through you to the Assemblywoman David Bobzian, for the record, Director of the Governor's Office of Energy. I think I got your questions down. I think the first question was about how we differentiated, particularly when it comes to gas, the difference between the use of gas for generation of electricity and the other category, which is commercial and residential use. And yes, for purposes of thinking about burning it at a distributed endpoint use, whether that's in a commercial setting or whether that's a residential setting, that is certainly very different from its use to generate electricity. And so that's where we start from there. I think Director Lovato will go more into the modeling part of that. But if you were to look again at slide 4 that shows the greenhouse gas emissions, this chart in particular, I think is very instructive for this high level discussion because it shows the tremendous progress that has been made on the policy front by previous legislatures, particularly the last legislature, in setting that aggressive RPS. And because of that, we've seen more and more renewables enter the energy mix. Prior to that, there had been efforts to retire aspects of the coal fleet. And I think that what you're seeing now is between policy making state by state, as well as just the overall economics of operating a coal-fired power plant. That coal is certainly on a steady decline at this point. And in many cases, and I think in Nevada, it shows, we've had replacement by renewable resources as well as natural gas resources. And so the recommendation about the long-term trends transfer from natural gas and other fossil fuels that are still part of the electricity mix. In many ways, again, we've made so much progress with the RPS, you can see that steady projection of a downward trend, but there will still have to be concerted effort and attention on eventually transitioning from gas for electricity. Now, some of that is technological, certainly the evolution of battery technology. Southern Nevada in particular, these are exciting times for the deployment of utility scale solar projects that are coupled with battery storage, being able to dispatch power on a time horizon that exceeds when a solar panel is collecting sun, so that it becomes more like a gas-fired unit that can provide energy at a moment's notice. Certainly future evolution of that technology for longer time horizons of battery storage, the importance of geothermal energy as a dispatchable resource, that all comes into play as we're considering the ultimate retirement of all coal assets. I think your question about transmission is a very important one, and that'll prompt my favorite answer. It's complicated, but certainly what you see and what we've already seen, particularly in Southern Nevada, with the retirement of assets in Clark County, is that we have, almost across the street, certainly solar development that has popped up. So your distance wire-wise isn't necessarily any different, but you actually tap into a very important question for Nevada long-term and ultimately an opportunity that we are a keystone state when it comes to the geography and the resource mix to serve load in neighboring states, to be able to benefit from different generating resources, whether it's wind from all the way from Wyoming to serve our needs in Nevada when the sun isn't shining, the ability for us to pull power from the Pacific Northwest. And that is a transmission question, and how we work with other states in a regional setting on that overall Western grid and transmission. That is a very important topic. It's one that my office is a part of in terms of moving that conversation forward on a regional basis. And so stay tuned on that. That's it's one of my favorite topics. But I think I'll turn it over to someone who really knows what he's talking about, and that's Director Lovato, who can dive in a little bit more on those questions you had about creating the buckets for consideration.
Thank you, Director Bobzian. Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong, Greg Lovato, NDP Administrator for the record. I think your first question was why are the commercial and residential sectors lumped together in our inventory? Yeah, that's really just a function of the tool that we use, which is a EPA state inventory tool, but I could try to break it down a little bit more for you. We look back to 2005 and forward to 2039 for our projections. And over that time period, on average, you see about 10% of the emissions statewide coming from both residential and commercial sectors. And it looks like it's about equivalent between the two throughout that period. Most of what you're seeing in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from residential and commercial, as opposed to industrial sector, is from combustion of natural gas for heating. There's some small amount of heating oil that people still use, but that's a much smaller percentage than combustion of natural gas. So I hope that answers your question about commercial, residential, and breaks it down a little bit further in terms of, so you're looking at roughly, 5 to 10% overall coming from the residential sector to total statewide emissions, depending on, what time period you use.
Thank you all for those answers. I appreciate it. This is Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Next up, we have a question from Assemblyman Miller.
Thank you, Chair. Assemblyman Miller for the record. My question is, when we talk about the cost of all of this directly to households, are there any strategies being discussed or that we're looking for helping our low-income families make this leap, as well as our rural families who may have, more challenges when it comes to distance and things like that, particularly when we look at transportation, getting new vehicles or like changing out their systems within their homes to go all electric. So overall, but also, kind of more specifically in those areas as well. Thank you.
Kristen Averett for the record, and thank you for the question, Assemblyman. So one thing that I did not cover in the presentation was the broader opportunities to really develop resources in the state to support climate action. In the same section where we calculated the social cost of carbon, which is the economics of climate action, we have a long catalog in there of the opportunities for federal resources to support climate action. These are resources that have been, where there have been appropriations in the past that perhaps could be, ginned up again, as well as appropriations that are currently in place. And again, these are federal resources available to support state climate action. So that is one tool that we put into the strategy. The second is that we lay out in that section really kind of the basics of carbon pricing. That has been a very popular mechanism in really globally and in some states for figuring out how do we actually develop the resources to support climate action. And if we look at the carbon pricing network called RGGI, that's in essentially the New England corridor, over 40% of all of the revenue that they generate goes to low-income households to support the transition from off-say natural gas into electric, and to make sure that there is that just transition that really allows for equitable solutions. Similarly, the carbon pricing program that's in place in California, they do the same, over 40%, and I think this year it's 65%. I'll have to get back to you, but that information might actually be in the climate strategy. Of those resources go directly back into marginalized communities. So thank you for the question.
Assemblyman Miller, did you have a follow-up?
No, I think I'll look through the strategy and the study more, and if I have questions, I'll follow up later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next up I have Assemblyman Watts, Vice Chair Watts.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And thank you, Dr. Abrett, and everyone else for the presentation. Very excited to see this climate action continue to move forward. So I have a few questions, if the chair will indulge, and they are kind of continuing to focus on what are the next steps. And so one of the things that I appreciate is, you talked a little bit about what other states are doing in terms of restructuring kind of some of their government operations to incorporate climate. And you also mentioned how the Department of Transportation has incorporated climate explicitly into how they're planning and executing their work. And I think you noted on one of the slides that 15 agencies were involved in some way in the creation of the strategy. And so I was wondering if any other agencies either already are or are in the process of incorporating climate more explicitly into how they plan and create their internal policies and programs and initiatives.
Vice Chair Watts, Brad Kroll for the record. I'll take the first shot at that and let others jump in if need be. So we're at the stage right now where various executive branch agencies are at varying levels of incorporating climate into their activities and their operations. I will just frankly admit that some probably haven't done any of it. Some are farther along, like NDOT. But what's really needed is what Dr. Abrett mentioned, is that the part of climate governance is giving direction explicitly to the executive branch agencies about what types of things they should implement to lower their emissions profile, save money, quite honestly, by having more efficient vehicle fleets, for instance, having more efficient buildings. And we discovered during this COVID-19 pandemic that our systems at the state level were very antiquated, and we weren't prepared to go all digital as quickly as we did. As quickly as was being required, and we're still struggling with it, quite frankly. So as the state puts more investment into upgrading our infrastructure within government agencies, we can do that with an eye towards lowering our greenhouse gas emissions profile, and we should do that because, quite frankly, that near-term investment is needed for basic operations, for one, but two, that near-term investment will pay off with medium and long-term savings.
Great. Thank you. This is Assemblyman Watts for the record again. The next question I had was, and you spoke just a little bit to this as well about some of the federal government initiatives around this, and that it's going to take a comprehensive approach, systemically at all levels of government. So I was wondering if you could also speak to what you're seeing in local governments here in the state of Nevada, what the state's engagement with local government's been, and where you might see us heading in the future, especially, in conversations around building codes, zoning, and other things that can have an impact on climate emissions.
So Kristen Averett for the record, so through the chair, Assemblyman Watts. There have been multiple conversations already across the municipalities. We've talked with multiple cities, with multiple counties about how we were building the strategy, what we were doing moving forward. We were trying to elicit what are they doing with respect to climate or climate resilience, climate mitigation, and whatnot. That said, we have limited resources, and there are only so many people that can be engaged in those conversations at one time. That said, if there are specific organizations, entities, municipalities that we should be reaching out to that any of you are aware of, we are all ears, and we really welcome those kind of suggestions, because it is important that way, like you said, that we are all at the table and that we harmonize those policies.
Thank you, Dr. Abbott. I appreciate that. Again, Assemblyman Watts for the record. One other thing I just wanted to bring up, especially as chair of the Natural Resources Committee, I know we've spent a lot of time talking about greenhouse gas reduction in terms of reducing what we're putting out in emissions. But, I know that the inventory also mentions carbon sequestration and capture, and the role that habitat restoration and enhancement can play in that. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more and provide any additional thoughts that you have in that area as part of the strategy to get us towards net zero.
Vice Chair Watts, Brad Kroll for the record. I'll take the first part of this. So in terms of greenhouse gas capture from power plants, that's one element of this. But in terms of sequestration in Nevada, I think we have plentiful opportunities that we can hugely build upon. Our landscapes are amenable to providing more sequestration of greenhouse gases than they probably are now. That being said, we're still doing some pretty important and necessary data collection and analysis, because a lot of the work that's been done on the work of landscapes in sequestering carbon has been focused on forest landscapes, not so much on scrub-brush, rangeland, sagebrush landscapes. So we are doing, we have a grant right now with the American Forests to do some cooperative work in this area. And there is some money in this budget proposed by the governor for our Division of Natural Heritage to look at this, study this issue further and find out where our opportunities and our challenges are across Nevada for enhancing sequestration of carbon. Many people don't realize that Nevada actually has lots of wetlands, but we don't have a good inventory and catalog of them and how they work as an ecosystem service. So we need to look at our sagebrush, our rangelands, and our wetlands in terms of what opportunities there are for sequestration. And personally, I would like to see our very successful to date efforts in preserving sagebrush habitat for the benefit of the sage grouse as incorporating a carbon component in those mitigation projects that we do.
Thank you for that, Director Kroll. I appreciate that. I think there are some other areas where we could incorporate climate into some of the other habitat work that we're doing. And I appreciate you noting the need for us to study and understand how other landscapes other than just forests can assist in that effort. So I appreciate all the work that you have all put into this strategy. I'm looking forward to working with members of this committee and others who serve on Ways and Means as we look at some of those budget items. And I have a couple of bills coming up that are related to some of the areas discussed in the climate strategy. So appreciate the invitation to work in partnership with you and the executive branch as we continue to progress in this area. That's all I have, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Watts. You asked a few of the questions that I was going to ask. Just before we wrap this up, on slide 27, during the presentation, there was a mention that for the stakeholders and community engagement, and you had said you wanted to do better in bringing more people to the table. Could you just let us know who those people should be that aren't involved now or that were not involved in putting this report together, or organizations?
So, Madam Chair, Kristen Averett for the record. I would say it's what I felt was more that I would have liked a little bit more outreach, in the sense to let people know that we were working on the strategy and to get them engaged. And it was just very difficult. I hate to use the pandemic as an excuse, but as we were starting this up and starting to ramp this up, it was very difficult to get messaging out that wasn't kind of focused on one particular topic. And so it's really, again, this is part of that assessment that we addressed in the complex challenges component of the strategy of, hey, we're working on this. We need to get the word out. What do people care about? And there are people that don't even realize they're working on climate issues, but they are. And we need to try and bring people into the fold. We did our best, and we need to do better again, to try and get the word out there, and particularly to engage marginalized communities, whether it's Latinx, Black communities, as well as our rural communities, to try and engage in that conversation. And so I think just letting people know that we are moving forward on climate action and we want to hear from them, and that outreach is going to be really important to get that message out there. Then we can help identify all the people that want to be at the table. They just need to know that there's a table there first. So hopefully that answers your question.
That does answer my question, and it leads into my last question, or maybe more of a comment. I love that you said that, the outreach into different communities. When on that same screen, slide 27, when you spoke about the executive leadership and staff and the net zero transition office, as you look to where that's going to be located, I think it would be beneficial for the state. We have learned as we've lived through this pandemic that we can work from anywhere and communicate from anywhere within the state because we've been forced to do it. I would like to see, as we move forward in the build out of that office is located closer to those communities that you were not able to get in communication with, because I believe that if that office is located closer to those communities and those urban core areas, you would get more buy-in from the communities around that office because they would feel more engaged.
Chair Danielle, Chair Moreno, Brad Cole for the record. If you can help us receive or identify resources for an office like this, we will put it wherever you want and put your name on it.
I don't have to have my name on it, but you should have never told me that because I will definitely find it. All right. Well, I have no other members that have questions or ask for questions. So, Doctor, go ahead. Please go ahead. No. Okay.
Madam Chair, if you're offering for closing remarks from the panel, I would love to take a crack at them. Just again, thank you, Madam Chair, for your long-term commitment and interest in this topic, for giving us the opportunity today to make this presentation, and thanks to the members of the committee for receiving it and considering it, and getting in the game and helping us with this. I would quickly highlight one other thing that we didn't really get to talk about, but that Vice Chair Watts brought up at the start of his questioning, and that is the federal activity. I can assure you that our climate initiative team, it seemed right as we were putting the final ink on the strategy itself going into December, we quickly had to shift into transition conversations, and now we are in communications with various agencies in the Biden administration. And I know it's not lost on members of this committee that it is impressive the degree to which climate has been stitched through the entire incoming administration, whether it's the U.S. Department of Transportation, whether it's energy, whether it's interior, through the appointments that are being made. And so we are very excited, but we're doing a lot of work right now to try to keep up and understand what the landscape means at the federal level, what the opportunities are for the state of Nevada, and there are very specific ones. And so our team, the governor's office, our representation in Washington, D.C., that helps us keep on top of this, and certainly our congressional delegation, we are all very busy and excited about what the coming months hold as we try to navigate our way out of this pandemic into an economic opportunity of embracing climate action as a path forward for Nevada's prosperity. So we look forward to working with all of you in that effort, and just want to share our excitement about the months to come.
Thank you so much, Director Babzine. So with that, members, that brings us to the next item on our agenda. That will be public comment. I'm not seeing any other questions from any other members. So just as a reminder, those that are watching, you can register online to either speak to the committee by telephone, or you may enter your written comments for the record on the webpage for today's meeting on Nellis. It's located on the legislature's website. You will see buttons allowing you to submit your online opinion or participate in writing or by phone. If you're calling in, please remember to clearly and slowly state your name and spell your name for the record. We ask that you limit your comments to 3 minutes or less to accommodate comments from others. May we have the first caller? I believe there's 5 callers in our queue, so we'll give our BPS staff just a few minutes to let in our callers. And I want to thank our presenters again. Wonderful presentation and wonderful dialogue and questions from the committee members.
Thank you, Chair. Will the caller with the last 3 digits 133 please slowly state and spell your name for the record? You will have 3 minutes and you may begin.
Hi, yes, hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we
We can
can.
hear you,
All
yes.
right, hi, my name, awesome, perfect. Hi, everyone, my name is Alexa Espuro Loaiza, ALEXA, AISTURO LOAIZA, and I'm here representing Chispa, Nevada. I'd like to start off with thanking Governor Sisolak and his administration for taking the climate crisis seriously and commissioning the state climate strategy. I'd also like to thank Dr. Avery, who last week presented the strategy report to about 60 of our Chispa, Nevada community members and answered dozens of our questions. We were excited to hear that the state is planning for how to tackle this crisis, and especially that climate justice was one of the metrics used to analyze potential policies. Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Nevadans are bearing the worst impacts of climate change, with more extreme heat and dirtier air in our neighborhoods. Climate justice should not only be part of the analysis, but the guiding principle of state's plan. We can't achieve our climate goals if we leave our communities and future generations behind. The state's goals are achievable if there is a focus on ensuring middle and low income have access to solutions for solving the climate crisis, whether it's more energy efficient products, electric vehicles, or solar panels in our neighborhoods. At the moment, these innovations are unaffordable and unavailable to far too many Nevadans, particularly communities of color. The state needs to close this access and affordability gap. We are also interested in learning what's next, how the state plans to implement some of these ideas in the climate strategy, and specifically how they will ensure climate justice is ensured and centered in all future plans. We'd also like to know who will be tasked with moving this forward. We recommend the state issue a separate report laying out steps needed to fully achieve climate justice. This can serve as a roadmap for future legislative sessions and regulatory proceedings. We cannot afford to not act. Like the report says, our economy will lose billions of dollars if we do nothing. Worse yet, we'll lose countless lives through early deaths that could have been prevented. We also commend the state for its community outreach efforts and would like to ask that the state make its efforts more inclusive and accessible by providing materials and presentations in multiple languages and in multiple ways, so not that only English speakers who have internet access can participate in protecting our climate. Thank you so much for hearing me out.
Thank you so much for joining us. Can we get the next caller in the queue?
With caller with the last three digits 133, please slowly spell and state your name for the record. You'll have 3 minutes. You may begin. With caller with the last three digits 443, please slowly spell and state your name for the record. You will have 3 minutes. You may begin. Will the caller with the last four digits 549, please slowly spell and state your name for the record. You will have 3 minutes. You may begin.
Hi, my name is Sarah Steinberg. That's S-A-R-A-H. Steinberg, S-T-E-I-N-B-E-R-G. And I'm a policy principal with Advanced Energy Economy. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. AEE is an industry association comprised of businesses dedicated to making the energy we use secure, clean, and affordable. We represent over 100 companies that include technologies such as energy efficiency, demand response, solar, wind, storage, electric vehicles, advanced metering infrastructure, transmission and distribution equipment, geothermal, hydropower, software, among others. Used together, these technologies and services create and maintain a higher performing energy and transportation system, one that's reliable and resilient and diverse and cost effective, while also improving the availability and quality of customer-facing services. AEE also represents large electricity consumers interested in increasing their purchases of affordable, clean energy to power their operations in the state. I first want to applaud the governor and his administration for the ambitious undertaking that was the state climate strategy. The strategy identifies many critical policy priorities necessary to achieve Nevada's emissions reduction goals. AEE is particularly glad to see such an emphasis in the report on building and transportation electrification and regional power sector cooperation that will help Nevada reduce emissions while maintaining reliability and low-cost electricity. Our members see huge economic development potential in the policies that the climate strategy lays out, which makes Nevada a top opportunity state for them to invest their resources, create new jobs, add to state and local tax revenues, and help consumers save money, be that through lower cost electricity generation, energy efficiency, and other demand-side programs, and electric vehicle consumer choice. They stand ready to invest and ready to help you shape these policies to ensure maximum economic benefits from the clean energy transition. These benefits aren't just theoretical. We've seen strong growth from these sectors in the past and fully expect them to drive economic recovery and diversification over the next few years and decades to come. The climate strategy policies allow Nevada to get ahead of that curve and reap the economic and jobs benefits sooner rather than later. Thank you for your time, and AEE looks forward to working with the legislature this session and beyond on the climate strategy implementation.
Thank you. Do we have any more callers in the waiting room?
Chair, we have 2 more callers. I will queue them up shortly.
Thank you.
Will the caller with the last 3 digits 155 please slowly spell and state your name for the record? You will have 3 minutes. You may begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. For the record, my name is Christy Cabrera, CHRISTI I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director for the Nevada Conservation League. First off, I would like to thank the Nevada State Climate Team for all of their work going into the report. The Nevada Conservation League has been keeping a very close eye on that process, and we were really excited to see the report when it finally came out. The Nevada State Climate Strategy makes it clear that in order to meet our strong climate goals, we need to electrify transportation, transition away from fossil fuels such as gas and coal, and invest in green jobs. Nevada has a lot to be proud of in our work to move towards a clean energy future, but we can't slow down now. As home to some of the fastest warming cities in the United States, Nevada is already feeling the effects of climate change. Earlier this week, the Nevada Conservation League Education Fund released survey results that explore Nevadans' views on climate change and our state's response. The data shows that Nevadans understand the threat of the climate crisis and want to see leaders take bold, aggressive action to mitigate its harmful effects on our communities before it's too late. 82% of Nevada voters believe that climate change is a serious problem, and 67% believe it is already having a serious impact on this part of the country. Nearly 65% support lawmakers taking strong action to combat climate change and believe that taking action will have positive effects on our families, our climate and weather, and our economy. Nevada has made strides to become a cleaner and greener state, but we are still not on track to meet our climate goals, and there is still plenty of work to be done. We look forward to continuing to work with the Nevada Climate Initiative team and the legislature to find solutions to this crisis, and we thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next caller.
Will the caller with the last 3 digits of 443 please slowly spell and state your name? You'll have 3 minutes. You may begin. Chair, it appears that this caller is having trouble unmuting.
We'll give the caller just another minute or two to fix the problem. With all of the meetings virtually, maybe having a little difficulty with bandwidth, connectivity, and things, so we will be patient.
Caller with the last 3 digits 443, please press *6 to unmute. Chair, the caller has still not unmuted.
Okay. Well, I thank everyone that was able to get through on the public comment line. For those of you that were unable to get through, I apologize for that, but I encourage you to send us your written comments that we can add to the records for this meeting. And this is just the first of a number of meetings for the committee. And I encourage you to continue to join us on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1:30 p.m. for very interesting discussions on this committee. But if you were not able to get through today, I do apologize. Please send us your written comments. And again, you can reach us through Nellis on the legislative website to get the call-in number and the meeting ID. So if there's no one else in the waiting room, that will conclude our meeting today. And thank you for everyone that did participate through public comment, to our presenters, to the committee members, and especially to our broadcast staff. Our next meeting for the Assembly Committee on Growth and Infrastructure will be Tuesday, February 9th at 1:30. We'll have several presentations from agencies that are involved in Nevada's transportation sector. So with that, members, this meeting is adjourned. I wish you a great rest of your day. And we'll see you.